The morning sun rose quietly over the pristine suburban neighborhood, where lawns were clipped like velvet. Mailboxes gleamed with fresh coats of white paint, and the streets carried the sterile charm of perfection. It was the kind of place that looked postcard-worthy, but behind its manicured hedges, the grip of the Homeowners Association ran strong. Rules were written, rewritten, and enforced with a zeal that often blurred the line between order and obsession. And at the center of much of that obsession was Karen. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for nearly a decade, long enough to establish herself as both a self-appointed enforcer and self-righteous arbiter of community order. She wasn't just a member of the HOA, she was its most vocal crusader. With an endless supply of complaint forms, meetings, and sudden inspections, Karen treated the HOA like her personal kingdom. Every car parked too close to the curb, every trash can rolled out 10 minutes early, every holiday decoration that didn't conform to community standards was a personal affront to her sense of control. Into this carefully maintained world came the presence of my Harley-Davidson. Sleek, black, and unapologetically loud, it was my pride and joy, the machine I had saved years to buy and maintained with meticulous care. It wasn't just a motorcycle, it was a statement. To me, it meant freedom and a life outside the suffocating perfection of HOA oversight. But to Karen, it was a violation of everything she imagined her neighborhood should represent. The first time she saw it gleaming in my driveway, I could sense her distaste. She stood across the street, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line, watching me wipe down the chrome with slow, satisfied strokes. Her son, a spoiled teenager who had grown accustomed to getting whatever he demanded, soon noticed the Harley, too. Unlike his mother, though, his gaze wasn't filled with contempt. It was filled with entitlement. The boy would linger near the edge of my property, pretending to kick a ball or check his phone, but his eyes always fell back to the Harley. Over time, his curiosity turned into arrogance. He began making loud remarks about how the motorcycle should be his, boasting to friends about what he would do once he got it. What started as idle teenage bravado began to take on the tone of insistence, as though he truly believed ownership of my Harley was his birthright. I, however, had bigger matters on my plate than a teenager's fantasies or Karen's endless crusades. At the time, I was working with the state attorney's office on a briefing that carried real weight. It wasn't neighborhood politics, it was legal strategy, an official matter that demanded precision, concentration, and professionalism. I was preparing documents, scheduling calls, and ensuring my points were airtight. The irony was sharp. While I was busy with matters that could shape legal outcomes, Karen was winding herself into a storm over what sat quietly in my driveway. But storms in neighborhoods like this never arrived without warning. The first tremor came when Karen approached the HOA board with a complaint. She claimed that the Harley was an eyesore and a disruptive influence in the community. According to her, its presence lowered property values, attracted the wrong kind of attention, and clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. She even suggested that the mere fact it wasn't a standard four-wheeled vehicle made it unacceptable. The HOA, weary of Karen's endless stream of complaints but unwilling to stand against her, sent me a notice. It was written in vague official language, citing concerns about compliance and requesting that I reassess the storage location of my motorcycle. I knew immediately whose hand was behind the letter. Karen's fingerprints were all over it. Ignoring her would have been easy enough. I had the right to keep my Harley, and I knew the HOA bylaws well enough to understand that they had no authority to dictate what vehicles I owned or displayed. But Karen was not the type to stop at a letter. Her son's sense of entitlement, had begun to merge with her zeal, creating a dangerous momentum. The boy started approaching me directly, making bold comments about how I should just let him ride it or pass it down since, in his words, it would look better with someone his age. His mother reinforced this behavior, dropping hints about how some people in the neighborhood didn't need flashy things that disrupted the harmony of the community. It was absurd, laughable even, but the situation carried a weight of tension I couldn't ignore. Still, my priorities remained fixed on the briefing with the state attorney. I had spent weeks gathering information and refining arguments. My Harley, my neighborhood, and Karen's antics were a nuisance, but they couldn't derail something this important. The day of the briefing arrived. I had set up everything in my home office, ensuring my internet connection was stable, my documents were neatly stacked, and my focus was undisturbed. Outside, the neighborhood carried on with its usual quiet routine. I didn't notice Karen's son loitering near my driveway again, nor did I see Karen herself pacing the sidewalk across the street. My attention was entirely locked onto my notes and the voices of the legal team on the call. But Karen noticed. She saw me sitting at my desk, papers spread around, dressed in a crisp shirt, speaking in calm but firm tones to someone on the other end of the line. She didn't know who I was talking to or what it was about. All she saw was a man ignoring her son's demands, guarding a motorcycle she believed didn't belong in her neighborhood, and behaving as though her influence didn't matter. To her, it was a direct challenge, and challenges were something Karen didn't take lightly. As my briefing continued, she dialed a number she had used many times before. She called the police. By the time I wrapped up the final portion of the briefing, outlining critical points with the state attorney's team, flashing lights reflected faintly against my office window. I turned, startled, as the sharp beams of red and blue bounced off the pristine siding of the houses across the street. The sound of engines idling filled the air. Karen had escalated. She had told the police that there was a disturbance, that her son had been threatened, and that something illegal was happening inside my home. And just like that, the boundary between neighborhood drama and official business shattered in an instant. The knock on my door came sharp and authoritative, a sound that carried the weight of urgency. At first, I thought it couldn't possibly be meant for me. My briefing with the state attorney had just concluded successfully, and the sense of accomplishment still lingered in the room. But the second knock was louder, followed by the faint call of voices identifying themselves as law enforcement. My stomach dropped. Peering through the window, I saw 2 patrol cars parked at the curb, their lights flashing, illuminating the carefully manicured hedges and sterile sidewalks. Officers stood in the yard, scanning the property with measured professionalism. Across the street, Karen and her son lingered like spectators, their faces painted with a mix of satisfaction and feigned concern. She had escalated beyond petty complaints. This was a full attempt to drag me into chaos. I opened the door, and the officers immediately began asking pointed questions. They spoke of a call about threats, disturbances, and even insinuations of criminal behavior. The words struck me like stones hurled without warning. Someone had accused me of intimidation, of keeping dangerous property, and of creating a hostile environment for young residents of the neighborhood. It was clear whose narrative this was. Karen had crafted a story designed to portray herself and her son as victims while painting me as the antagonist. As the officers looked over my property, their gaze fell inevitably on the Harley. It sat quietly in the driveway, glinting in the fading light of the day, its presence commanding attention. One officer jotted notes while the other asked about ownership, registration, and use. Their professionalism was steady, but the underlying suspicion was impossible to ignore. Karen had succeeded in planting seeds of doubt. While I provided documents to verify everything, the title, registration, proof of insurance, I couldn't help but notice Karen whispering animatedly to her son across the street. She gestured with sweeping motions, pointing toward my house and then to the Harley, as though orchestrating a scene in which she played the righteous protector of the neighborhood. The boy, emboldened by the attention, puffed out his chest and nodded along, rehearsing his role in her story. The officers, to their credit, remained neutral as they processed the situation. They verified my paperwork, confirmed there was no disturbance inside the home, and found nothing illegal or threatening. But the damage wasn't in the facts. It was in the perception. The flashing lights, the presence of law enforcement, the subtle looks from passing neighbors who slowed their cars to witness the spectacle. All of it painted a narrative that Karen wanted. She had managed to turn a legal professional preparing for a briefing into the subject of gossip and suspicion. When the officers finally concluded their visit, they offered no citations or charges. They simply explained that a report had to be filed, that a call had been made, and that they were required to respond. As they drove away, the lights fading into the distance, the silence that returned to the neighborhood felt heavier than before. It wasn't relief. It was the weight of knowing Karen had crossed a line, and she wouldn't stop there. Across the street, Karen gave a small wave, a gesture that was less neighborly and more smugly victorious. Her son smirked, muttering something, under his breath as they both turned toward their home. To them, this was only the beginning. That night, I sat in my home office replaying the day's events. My work with the state attorney had been critical, yet overshadowed by Karen's theatrics. The fact that she was willing to call the police during my professional engagement wasn't just harassment. It was an intentional strike at my credibility. She wanted to paint me as unstable, unfit, and out of line with the standards of the neighborhood. But beneath her calculated malice was her son's relentless fixation on my Harley. I realized then that this wasn't simply about property values, rules, or appearances. The boy had become obsessed with the idea that the motorcycle belonged to him, and Karen was leveraging her HOA influence and police connections to push the narrative forward. It was entitlement masquerading as neighborhood order. Over the next few days, the fallout spread. Neighbors whispered at mailboxes and over fences, some offering polite nods in my direction, while others avoided eye contact. Word of police activity had circulated quickly, and speculation took root in the silence Karen left deliberately unchallenged. She let the rumors grow, knowing they worked in her favor. Meanwhile, her son escalated. He began leaving notes near my driveway, sloppily scribbled demands that I be reasonable and let him have the Harley. Sometimes they were disguised as jokes, but the undercurrent of insistence was clear. He lingered outside longer, pacing near the edge of my property, waiting for opportunities to corner me with entitled remarks. The HOA, pressured by Karen's influence, followed up with another notice. This time the wording was stronger, suggesting that the presence of recreational vehicles in the driveway might not align with community guidelines. It was laughably thin, but the intent was obvious. Karen was tightening the noose, manufacturing pressure until I gave in. I filed my own response, citing bylaws and legal precedents, leaving no doubt that my Harley was within my rights. But even as I pushed back on paper, I knew the real battle was happening in perception, reputation, and persistence. Karen wasn't fighting for rules. She was fighting for dominance. The tension came to a head one afternoon when I returned home to find the Harley tampered with. The cover had been pulled back, fingerprints smudged across the chrome, and the ignition lock scratched as though someone had tried to force it. My stomach churned with anger and unease. It was more than curiosity now. It was attempted theft. And there was no mistaking who had the motive. Standing there in the driveway, I realized the line had been crossed yet again. Karen's son wasn't just entitled, he was emboldened. And Karen herself would twist any confrontation into further justification for her campaign. The neighborhood had gone from picture-perfect order to a simmering battlefield, and my Harley had become the symbol at the center of it all. What neither Karen nor her son realized, though, was that I wasn't someone who backed down easily. The police report they filed had left a trail, the HOA letters were records, and now, with evidence of tampering, the story was beginning to build against them instead of me. The pieces were aligning for a confrontation that neither of them would be able to control. The sight of my Harley tampered with sent a cold wave of anger through me. For years, I had cared for that machine with a level of pride few people could understand. Every scratch polished away, every bolt tightened, every surface gleaming. It was more than a vehicle. It was a statement of who I was. To find it meddled with, smudged and scarred by clumsy hands was not just vandalism. It was a violation. I knew immediately that Karen's son was behind it. His fixation had been growing by the day, transforming from idle interest into a dangerous obsession. I had ignored his cocky remarks, his posturing at the edge of my driveway, and his childish notes demanding I hand it over. But the scratches around the ignition weren't playful. They were evidence of intent. He had tried to take what was mine. The question was whether Karen knew. Part of me believed she did. After all, she had already shown how far she was willing to go in bending reality to fit her narrative, even calling the police with false claims to portray me as a threat. It wasn't difficult to imagine her turning a blind eye, or even encouraging her son's actions. So long as it aligned with her crusade against me, I documented everything. Photographs of the fingerprints, close-ups of the scratched lock, notes detailing the time and circumstances. I filed a report with the police, calm and factual, resisting the urge to lace it with the frustration boiling inside me. The officer at the desk recognized my name immediately. He had been one of those dispatched to my house during Karen's staged disturbance call. His tone was professional, but I caught the faint flicker of recognition in his eyes. He understood now that there was more to this story than a neighborhood squabble. When I returned home that evening, the neighborhood was alive with whispers again. People slowed as they passed my house, their gazes darting between me and the Harley. Karen stood in her driveway, arms crossed, her son slouched beside her. They didn't speak, but the smugness in their posture said enough. To them, my filing a report was just another battle in their war, proof that I was rattled. The following days only heightened the tension. I noticed the boy lingering at night now, his silhouette barely visible in the glow of street lamps. I caught him circling on his bike, pausing near the Harley before darting away. The audacity of it all was staggering. He wasn't afraid of being caught. In his mind, the motorcycle already belonged to him. And Karen, she doubled down. She began, speaking to neighbors directly, weaving her story with the skill of someone who had been practicing manipulation for years. According to her, I was unstable, aggressive, and prone to intimidating her son. She painted the Harley as a dangerous distraction, a loud and reckless machine that threatened the serenity of their carefully crafted community. She whispered about how I had brought the police into the neighborhood and suggested I was one incident, away from losing control. For some, her words stuck. They avoided me, their polite smiles turning to tight-lipped glances. Others saw through it, though, their quiet nods of support reminding me I wasn't entirely alone. But the split in perception was enough to make daily life uncomfortable. Every step outside felt like walking onto a stage where half the audience jeered and the other half stayed silent. Then came the escalation I had been dreading. One afternoon, as I worked from home, I heard the unmistakable roar of an engine outside. My pulse spiked. It was my Harley. For a split second, confusion clouded my thoughts. I hadn't started it, hadn't even touched it since filing the police report. Racing to the window, I saw the scene unfold. Karen's son, wobbling unsteadily on the seat of my Harley, the key jammed into the scratched ignition, attempting to ride it down the street. The sound was guttural, raw, and wrong. The boy had no control over the machine. His hands jerked the handlebars wildly, the bike lurching forward with jerky, uneven bursts of speed. Neighbors gasped, stepping back from the sidewalk. Karen stood at the curb, screaming words I couldn't hear but clearly encouraging her son. As though this was some triumphant moment, my heart slammed in my chest as I bolted outside. By the time I reached the driveway, the Harley had wobbled dangerously close to tipping, the boy's arrogance giving way to panic as he realized the power of what he was attempting to control. The motorcycle skidded sideways, the tires screeching, against the asphalt before crashing onto its side in a screech of metal and sparks. The boy tumbled off, unhurt but shaken, while my Harley lay scarred and dented in the middle of the street. Gasps filled the air as neighbors rushed forward, some to check on the boy, others staring at the wreckage of the motorcycle. Karen's face twisted between fury and feigned concern, her eyes darting from her son to me, already calculating how she would spin the incident. The rage inside me boiled. My Harley, my pride, the symbol of years of work and care, lay scraped and damaged because of Karen's unchecked entitlement and her son's arrogance. Yet before I could even fully process the damage, Karen began shouting accusations. She claimed I had left the motorcycle unsecured, that it was reckless to allow such a dangerous machine in a family neighborhood. Her son, emboldened by her defense, nodded quickly, pretending his attempt to steal and ride it had been nothing more than innocent curiosity. The scene was chaos. Neighbors argued among themselves, some pointing to the obvious truth, that the boy had no right to touch my property, while others hesitated, swayed by Karen's loud insistence that I was responsible. The line between fact and fiction blurred under the sheer force of her voice. I photographed the wreckage, the new dents and scratches, the position of the fallen Harley. I knew the importance of evidence, especially now that Karen had shown she would twist reality to suit her agenda. The police were called again, this time not by her, but by another neighbor who wanted the matter documented. When the officers arrived, the scene repeated itself in haunting familiarity, flashing lights, questions, paperwork. But this time, the evidence was clear. The boy had no business on my Harley, and the damage spoke for itself. Karen's arguments grew shrill, but her words were flimsy against the weight of proof. The officers noted everything, including my prior report about attempted tampering. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Yet even as they escorted Karen and her son back to their property, warning them sternly, I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't finished. To Karen, this wasn't a loss. It was another round in a battle. She intended to win, no matter the cost. That night, as I stared at my Harley, dented and bruised yet still salvageable, I realized this was no longer about a motorcycle. It was about control, about principle, and about standing against someone who believed the rules bent at her will. Karen had declared war, and I was ready to fight it to the end. The crash of the Harley was the breaking point. For weeks, the tension in the neighborhood had been simmering beneath the surface, disguised as gossip and petty complaints. But with the motorcycle now visibly scarred, the evidence of Karen's son's obsession was no longer hidden in whispers or suspicion. The truth lay dented and scraped on the pavement for everyone to see. The police had filed their report. Neighbors had witnessed the chaos, and yet Karen still refused to take accountability. That evening, she doubled down, sending a blast of emails to the HOA board. In her messages, she claimed I was a menace to the community, that my motorcycle was an attractive nuisance, and that her son had been endangered by its presence. She demanded disciplinary action, fines, and even floated the idea that I should be forced to remove the Harley entirely for the safety of residents. The board was trapped between exasperation and obligation. Karen's voice was loud, relentless, and threatening. She wielded HOA bylaws like weapons, twisting vague language into ammunition for her vendetta. Though many members were weary of her antics, none wanted to be the target of her wrath. So instead of dismissing her claims outright, they scheduled a hearing, a formal review of my violations. The notice landed in my mailbox 2 days later. It cited community concerns, referenced ongoing disturbances, and invited me to appear before the board to clarify my compliance with HOA standards. The absurdity of it was staggering. My Harley had been vandalized and nearly stolen, and yet I was the one summoned to defend myself. I knew, however, that this was no ordinary neighborhood dispute anymore. This was Karen maneuvering through the structures of power she had long exploited. She believed that with the right mixture of persistence, intimidation, and manipulation, she could force the board to turn against me. What she didn't realize was that her obsession had crossed into legal territory, and that was a battlefield I was prepared to fight on. I compiled everything, every notice, every HOA letter, every police report. I organized photographs of the scratches on the ignition, the aftermath of the crash, and even timestamps of when I had caught her son loitering near my property. My file grew thick, a paper shield against the barrage of accusations Karen had thrown my way. The day of the hearing arrived, held in the sterile meeting room of the HOA clubhouse. The board sat at a long table, papers stacked before them, expressions tight with the weight of responsibility. Neighbors filled the back rows, drawn by curiosity and the promise of drama. Karen sat front and center, her son beside her, both of them radiating smug confidence. The proceedings began with the board outlining the complaints. Karen seized her moment, speaking with performative outrage. She painted me as reckless, antisocial, and uncooperative, insisting that my Harley had disrupted the peace of the community and endangered her son. She described the motorcycle as a weapon of noise and chaos, claiming its presence had driven property values down. Her son chimed in, parroting her lines, nodding solemnly as though he were the victim of some great injustice. But when it was my turn, the tone shifted. I laid out the evidence with methodical precision, each piece documented and irrefutable. I described the attempted tampering, backed by police reports. I showed photographs of the damage caused during the failed theft. I read aloud sections of the HOA bylaws that explicitly permitted the storage of motorcycles on private property. Every fact chipped away at the carefully spun narrative Karen had crafted. By the end, the room was heavy with silence. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes betraying the truth they couldn't ignore. Karen's crusade had gone too far. The decision wasn't immediate. They recessed, claiming they needed time to deliberate. But the whispers in the room told the story. Neighbors who had once hesitated now muttered about Karen's overreach. Some shook their heads in disbelief at her son's arrogance. The tide was turning, yet Karen didn't retreat. Outside the meeting, as neighbors dispersed, she remained on the offensive. She spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, vowing that she wouldn't stop until the Harley was gone and that certain people were taught a lesson about respecting community standards. Her son smirked beside her, emboldened by her defiance. His gaze fixed on me with a mix of resentment and envy. In the days that followed, the board's official decision arrived. They could not find any violation of HOA rules regarding my Harley. The matter was, in their words, closed. It was a victory, but not the end. Karen would not accept the board's refusal as defeat. If anything, it only fueled her obsession. She escalated again, this time outside the boundaries of HOA procedure. She began filing nuisance complaints directly with local authorities, calling in every minor noise or perceived infraction. If I so much as started my Harley to let it idle, she dialed the non-emergency line reporting disturbances. If a package sat too long on my porch, she framed it as evidence of suspicious activity. The police, though professional, grew weary of her constant calls. Still, each visit reinforced the perception that something was wrong at my address. Her son, meanwhile, became bolder. He strutted around the neighborhood, bragging to friends that the Harley would eventually be his. He boasted that his mother was making moves to get it taken away. It was arrogance built on entitlement, fed by Karen's unrelenting campaign. But what neither of them expected was that I had begun building my own case, not just against the boy for vandalism and attempted theft, but against Karen herself. Harassment, false reports, defamation. I had documented everything. While she waged her war through whispers and theatrics, I prepared a counteroffensive rooted in facts and law. The turning point came late one evening, when yet another police car rolled down the street in response to one of Karen's complaints. The officer, weary and apologetic, hinted at what I already knew. The department had grown tired of her antics. There was only so much they could tolerate before her credibility wore thin. Karen didn't realize it yet, but the narrative she had so carefully constructed was beginning to crumble. Her son's arrogance was catching up to him, her complaints were losing traction, and her influence in the neighborhood was fraying. What she didn't know was that the next step wouldn't come from her. It would come from me, and it wouldn't be a letter, a hearing, or a whispered rumor. It would be something far more official, something she couldn't spin with her voice alone. The battle for perception was ending. The battle for accountability was about to begin. Karen had spent weeks trying to shape the narrative, but her grip was slipping. The HOA had ruled in my favor. The police had grown weary of her endless calls, and her son's arrogance had become more of an embarrassment than a weapon. Yet she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. For her, this was no longer about a motorcycle. It was about power, control, and her unyielding need to dominate anyone who refused to bow to her will. But while she was busy exhausting herself with phone calls and gossip, I had shifted my focus. I wasn't simply defending myself anymore. I was building a case. Every police report, every HOA notice, every complaint she had filed, documented and preserved. Every photograph of damage, every timestamp of her son's loitering, every witness statement from neighbors who had grown tired of her antics, collected and organized. Slowly, methodically, I was constructing a narrative of my own, one rooted in facts rather than theatrics. The first move came through the civil courts. I filed a formal complaint for harassment and defamation, citing Karen's repeated false reports and her public accusations. I also pursued damages for the vandalism and attempted theft of my Harley, naming her son directly but including Karen as guardian and enabler. It was a calculated strike, forcing the issue out of the realm of neighborhood drama and into the impartial scrutiny of the legal system. The news hit the neighborhood like a thunderclap. Word spread quickly that I had taken legal action. Some neighbors expressed quiet relief, admitting they had long grown tired of Karen's reign of intimidation. Others were shocked, uncomfortable with the idea of lawsuits piercing the bubble of suburban calm. But no one was more rattled than Karen herself. For the first time, she wasn't the one dictating the terms. She wasn't the complainant, the accuser, the one holding the clipboard of authority. She was the defendant, and no matter how loudly she protested, the papers had been served. Karen tried to spin it, of course. She told anyone who would listen that this was retaliation, that I was a bully using the courts to silence her. She leaned on her son's victimhood, portraying him as a misunderstood teenager unfairly targeted for one mistake. But her voice, once so commanding, now carried cracks of desperation. The neighbors had seen too much, witnessed too many of her theatrics, to accept her story uncritically. The HOA board, meanwhile, distanced themselves. They issued a statement clarifying that the motorcycle was not in violation of any rules and that the association was not a party to the legal matter. Their neutrality was deliberate. They wanted no part in Karen's mess. To her, that silence was betrayal. To me, it was confirmation that her influence was crumbling. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. Where once Karen had strutted with confidence, now she lingered with suspicion, watching me with narrowed eyes. Her son's swagger had evaporated, replaced by sullen avoidance. He no longer lingered near my driveway or bragged about taking the Harley. The reality of legal consequences had pierced his bubble of entitlement. When the court date finally arrived, the sterile formality of the courthouse was a stark contrast to the petty theatrics of the HOA clubhouse. Here, Karen's voice held no special weight. Here, her son's entitled smirks carried no influence. Facts mattered. Evidence mattered. And I had both in abundance. I presented the photographs of the damage to the Harley, the police reports documenting attempted tampering, the incident of the crash. I showed the sequence of HOA complaints, each escalating in tone, each clearly rooted in Karen's vendetta. I referenced the officer's notes about the repeated nuisance calls. Piece by piece, I constructed a picture of harassment, obsession, and reckless entitlement. Karen's defense was predictably dramatic. She claimed I had weaponized the legal system, that her son's actions were innocent curiosity, that my motorcycle was an unreasonable presence in a family neighborhood. But her theatrics fell flat against the evidence. The judge listened patiently, but the impatience in his tone when redirecting her was impossible to miss. The ruling was clear. Karen and her son were found liable for damages to the Harley. They were ordered to cover the costs of repair, along with court fees. Additionally, an injunction was granted forbidding further harassment, false reporting, or interference with my property. For the first time, there were consequences Karen couldn't shout her way out of. The aftermath rippled through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once tolerated Karen's behavior now saw her for what she was, a liability. Whispers turned into open criticism, her influence dissolving in the daylight of accountability. The board, once cautious in their dealings with her, now regarded her as more of a nuisance than a leader. Karen herself, though outwardly defiant, was shaken. The humiliation of losing in court, of being held financially and legally accountable, gnawed at her. Her son, once so bold, withdrew into silence, his fantasies of owning my Harley shattered by the reality of a repair bill his family now had to cover. For me, the victory was bittersweet. My Harley was still scarred, though repairable. The neighborhood, though quieter, carried the memory of the chaos, and Karen, though diminished, was not gone. People like her didn't simply stop. They simmered, they stewed, they plotted. I knew deep down that this wasn't the end. It was merely a turning point. Karen had lost her footing, but she hadn't surrendered. And the deeper truth was this: entitlement doesn't fade easily, and obsession doesn't die quietly. The neighborhood had witnessed a battle. What loomed Ahead was the possibility of a final, desperate act from someone who refused to accept defeat. The court ruling should have been the end of it. In any normal situation, it would have been. A judge had spoken, the evidence was clear, and accountability had been handed down. But Karen was not someone who knew how to lose gracefully. For her, the legal defeat was not closure. It was humiliation. And humiliation, in her mind, demanded retaliation. In the days following the judgment, the neighborhood seemed quieter. The constant whispers had died down, and for the first time in weeks, there were no police cars pulling into my driveway on the basis of her false calls. My Harley, though battered, was back from the shop, polished and restored to its former glory. I thought perhaps the storm had finally passed. But storms don't disappear. They gather strength in silence. Karen's demeanor shifted. Where once she had been loud and confrontational, now she was eerily quiet. She avoided direct confrontations, but her eyes told the story whenever I passed her house, narrowed, simmering with resentment, her lips pressed thin as though sealing in venom. Her son, too, retreated into sullen silence. He no longer loitered. Near my driveway, no longer smirked or boasted, but the absence of arrogance didn't feel like surrender. It felt like planning. The first sign came late one night. I was in my office when a faint sound reached my ears. Metal scraping, movement. In the dark. I peered out the window and froze. In the dim glow of the streetlight, I saw a figure crouched near my Harley. Even at a distance, the outline was familiar. Karen's son. I moved quickly, but by the time I reached the driveway, he had bolted. The motorcycle bore new scratches on the paint, crude lines etched with what looked like a key or knife. A message had been carved into the surface of the seat, jagged and angry. Mine! The fury that surged through me was overwhelming, but I forced myself to breathe, to think. This was exactly what Karen wanted. Another confrontation, another opportunity to twist the story. So instead, I called the police again, documenting everything. When they arrived, the evidence was undeniable. This wasn't speculation anymore. It was vandalism, deliberate and malicious. Karen appeared during the report, her robe clutched around her, her voice rising in protest. She tried to claim her son had been inside all evening, that I was fabricating the incident to harass them. But the officer's face betrayed his exhaustion. They had been called to this street too many times, and now the evidence was carved into leather and metal. The boy was cited. A formal record now followed him, something that Karen could not spin away with her words. Her shrill protests only worsened the situation, as the officers warned her that further interference could result in charges of her own. Still, I knew Karen's desperation hadn't yet peaked, and I was right. 2 nights later, the final act unfolded. It was just past midnight when I woke to the sound of commotion outside. Shouts, footsteps, and then the sharp crack of glass. Heart racing, I grabbed a flashlight and rushed to the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. Karen's son had smashed a bottle against the side of my garage, flames licking at the grass where accelerant had been poured. It wasn't just vandalism anymore, it was arson. An attempt to destroy not just the Harley, but everything around it. And behind him, in the shadows, I caught sight of Karen herself, watching, her face pale in the glow of the fire. I dialed 911 with shaking hands, my voice steady only through sheer force of will. Neighbors poured from their homes as the fire spread, some rushing with hoses to douse the flames. Within minutes, sirens filled the night, fire trucks roaring down the street, police cars in tow. The blaze was contained quickly, but the message was undeniable. This was no longer neighborhood drama. This was crime. The officers didn't hesitate this time. Karen's son was taken into custody, his protests drowned out by the weight of his actions. Karen herself screamed, pleaded, and tried to blame me, but her words carried no weight against the reality of flames still smoldering on my garage siding. The image of her watching silently as her son struck the match burned in the minds of every neighbor who had witnessed it. The fallout was immediate. Charges were filed, serious ones: arson, destruction of property, reckless endangerment. Karen, once untouchable in her own kingdom of HOA rules and neighborhood whispers, now stood disgraced, her influence shattered. Neighbors who had once tolerated her out of fear now turned openly against her, horrified by how far she had let her obsession spiral. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. The gossip faded, replaced by a newfound unity born from shared outrage. The HOA, desperate to distance itself from Karen, quietly stripped her of any committee roles she had once held. Her voice, once the loudest in every meeting, was gone. My Harley, though scarred again, was still standing, just like me. It had become more than a motorcycle. It was a symbol of resistance, of refusing to bend to entitlement and control. Karen and her son faced the consequences of their actions in court. For the first time, they were forced to answer not to me, not to the HOA, but to the law itself. And in that courtroom, there were no whispers, no theatrics, no neighbors to manipulate, only accountability. The story spread far beyond our neighborhood, whispered in nearby communities as a cautionary tale about entitlement, obsession, and the dangers of unchecked power. People spoke of the HOA Karen who called the cops, who tried to seize what wasn't hers, who watched as her son's arrogance consumed them both. As for me, I returned to my life, my work, and my Harley. The scars remained, but so did the strength that came from surviving the storm. Karen had called the cops, twisted the truth, rallied her son, and even turned to fire. But in the end, the truth endured, and the Harley was still mine.